Mine is get into sex work because things like poverty, systemic racism, and lack of protections and rights. If we treated sex work just as any other form of labour, I think this would be a good start in reducing the amount of underage people who were involved in the industry.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Prostasia Foundation's podcast series, Sex, Human Rights and CSA Prevention. I'm very fortunate to be joined today by not one but two special guests. We have Lola Hunt and Eliza Sorensen, who are two out of the three founders of sex worker and technologist collective Assembly 4 from Australia. Welcome, Lola and Eliza. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here.
So, for those of us who haven't heard of Assembly 4 before, please give us a brief rundown of who you are and what are the major projects that you're running.
So I'm Lola and this is Eliza, as you said. I'm a sex worker based in Melbourne and Eliza is an InfoSec. We are two of the three co-founders of Assembly 4. We're a small group of sex workers and technologists who have been working to develop products for sex workers. We've so far launched two platforms, the first being Switter and the second being tryst.link. Switter is a sex worker-friendly social network, which was launched in response to FOSTA SESTA and the shadow banning of sex workers' accounts from sites like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. tryst.link is our improvement on modern advertising for escorts. We sort of found that the current advertising options were not only extremely expensive for what they were, but they were also quite disrespectful towards sex workers and extremely outdated, so we knew that we could improve upon that.
So you mentioned in that answer FOSTA SESTA, which is the it was framed as an anti-sex trafficking law, but really just a broader attack on sex workers, wasn't it? It's interesting that one of the things that Assembly 4 and Prostasia Foundation have in common is we were both formed partly as a response to that, in your case to serve sex workers, and in our case to promote some better ways of combating child sexual abuse. So my question to you is, how daunting was it for you to attempt to fill the void left by the demise of Backpage, and what are some of the challenges that you faced in trying to bring these new services online?
Okay, so when we launched Twitter, we actually had no idea that Backpage was going to be seized in the first place. So we were totally unprepared for the influx of users that we saw. But one of the biggest challenges by far was working out how we were going to support a new platform that had thousands of users joining it each day in an industry that is highly discriminated against. We knew that Twitter needed a huge amount of attention, and juggling our day jobs with this probably was going to be borderline impossible. So we also knew that taking investment wouldn't work on a project like this, as investors are usually financially driven and focused, which we knew was inappropriate given the industry and a major flaw in some of the other business models that we saw. We decided to bootstrap the project with a few months of runway up our sleeve, and Tryst was born. So Tryst is our verified and paid ad platform, and it became the solution for funding Twitter. But Tryst has its own sort of problems, of course, like taking payments, ensuring workers' data is stored outside of the US.
So SESTA, FOSTA is a US law. You're based in Australia, right? So how are Australia's laws better than US laws when it comes to hosting sites like Tryst and Twitter? Tryst and Switter.
I'm not a lawyer, so I don't feel exactly qualified to say which laws are worse and better within Australia, but I think the primary difference between the two countries is how the US views sex work and how we view it. Sex work, for the most part, is a regulated and legalized industry. But Australia has 6 states and 2 territories. I feel like, oh God, do I have it right? With different rules and regulations, which makes it really confusing for not only workers, but for services trying to service sex workers around Australia. I think to ensure continued safety of sex workers, online and offline, we need decriminalisation. Decriminalisation is the only way we're going to be able to see platforms service sex workers in a way that's not evil.
Yeah, essentially.
And I know that Australia also in some ways has more strict laws when it comes to things like obscenity and so on. Has that been a problem for you?
Not as yet, but we don't know.
Yeah.
But fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. And this is one of the things. Laws can change. They can change day by day. We're seeing laws being passed for COVID, which is limiting sex workers' rights to work in Australia, despite the fact that massage parlours and things like that will be allowed to go a stage earlier. We already see discriminatory practices day by day. Unless we have legislation allowing sex workers to be seen as just a labourer, we're not going to be able to say we can protect you.
Yeah. So laws aren't the only battlefield for the sex work abolitionist groups. They're also currently leading a campaign to have the credit card companies deplatform adult websites. Have payments been a difficult area for you? You sort of alluded to that already, but tell us a bit more about how you managed to juggle these real problems with payments.
Yeah, so payments, as you can imagine, have been extremely difficult for us. When we started building out Tryst, we knew that mainstream US-based payment facilities like Stripe and PayPal were kind of off the cards. But we thought that because we were an Australian-based business, that Australian facilities and banks would take us on. As Eliza said, sex work is legal in most states and territories in Australia. We thought that getting a payment facility would maybe take us a few months, but we ended up being knocked back by, I think it was 6 or 7.
I think 6 banks officially, and I think the other bank was like, just don't bother.
Just don't even bother, which is obviously awful. And the process actually ended up taking us about a year to actually execute. Unfortunately for us and many other sex workers, the Anti-Discrimination Act in Australia doesn't cover a person's sexual labour, sexual preferences, or sexual activity or sexual practices. So we were unable to sort of make any formal complaint against this as well. It's a really complicated issue, but one of the reasons why we have these problems with financial institutions is the lack of distinction between sex trafficking and consensual sex work.
Yeah.
Visa, for example, like you're probably fully aware of this as well, but Visa, for example, has a clause in their core rule set which reads, a member must not use Visa-owned marks, I'm just going to read this off the screen right now, in relation to or for the purchase or trade of photographs, video imagery, computer-generated images, cartoons, simulation, or any other media or activities, including, but not limited to, any of the following: child pornography, bestiality, rape, or any other non-consensual sexual behaviour, and that one is one to note, non-consensual mutilation or of a person or a body part. As you know from buying anything online, MasterCard and Visa and American Express are 3 of the main ways to accept payment online. So when US-based companies make up the backbone of global online payment facilities, companies who work with them, such as Stripe, banks, PayPal, etc., choose to avoid servicing sex workers to reduce the risk of losing the payment facilities, so which is obviously problematic. What is interesting yet unsurprising is that they don't consider other forms of non-consensual work, i.e. forced labour, as high risk, so you don't see them putting the same restrictions on domestic sites like Airtasker, for example. So it seems to come down to what the US deems as palatable and not palatable.
So the next step after FOSTA in the war on sex and internet platforms, at least in the United States, is going to be the Earn It Act. Is this on your radar, and are there any lessons from the fight against FOSTA that you think that sex workers and allies should be bringing to the fight against the Earn It Act?
Yeah, unfortunately, the Earn It Act is on our radar. I think it should be on everyone's radar. But sex workers are some of the fiercest activists on the planet and have found such creative ways to advocate for themselves despite every platform pushing them off. Sorry about that. I think one of the things, I'm going to mainly speak to allies here, is educate yourself on the problem. Don't go in uneducated and try and take away from other people's voices. We hear that so often. If you are in a position to donate money, I know COVID is making everyone a little bit wary on donating at the moment, but give your money to the people who are fighting these pieces of legislation. We really need money. if you're in the US, call your reps. If you know someone in the US, make them call your reps. We need people to show their concern. The legislation hasn't passed. We still have time to prevent this from happening.
Yeah, so there's an alternative, as you probably know, the Invest in Child Safety Act, which we're supporting, Prostasia Foundation is supporting, with some amendments. Even there, I think there's an overemphasis possibly on enforcement. Everyone wants to see people who are committing sexual crimes to have to pay the price for that. But what they often don't realise is that there's a whole lot of enforcement resources that are diverted into consensual sex work, and that unless you lay down real clear boundaries on, this has to be just for child exploitation crimes, then this money is just going to be wasted on prosecuting consensual sex workers. That's not really a question. I just thought I'd throw that in. Do you have a position on the Invest in Child Safety Act? Have you looked at it yet?
I haven't. Oh, you go.
I've looked at it. I think that there are some things that do need to be changed, and there's organisations like yourself and the EFF who have stated what they believe need to be changed. They have folks at their disposal who actually understand legislation to how it can be applied. And we know in the United States you have to be very specific, otherwise it'll just paint everything. Otherwise, no one wants to see people getting hurt. I don't want our sites to be used for anyone to be used to get hurt, especially around children. We work so hard and we have so much resources dedicated to that specific thing. And it's really harmful when people assume malice on our part. It makes it harder for us to get help as well.
I think part of the problem is that people who are opposed to sex work and adult content online sort of lump those into a category of immorality, and they assume that if you're immoral in that sense, then you don't really care about child safety, you don't care about child sexual abuse, which is totally unfair and untrue. Having said that, I guess we're all agreed that there are minors who do attempt to go into sex work before they're of age, and that is a problem that has to be addressed in some way. And there are always going to be ways for them to do that. Like for as long as there are communication apps, especially encrypted communication apps, minors are going to congregate to those to join the industry maybe before they're ready. What can we do about that? What's the best tactic to either stop them from attempting to do sex work, or to help them at least when they're in that situation?
So I think that obviously this is a big problem, but I think that this could be said for many other kinds of labour as well. And I think that there's a bigger picture here that people often miss because they're so focused on the sexual element of it. Trafficking and minors get into sex work, so trafficking victims and things like that, and minors get into sex work because things like poverty, systemic racism, and lack of protections and rights. If we treated sex work just as any other form of labour, I think this would be a good start in reducing the amount of underage people who were involved in the industry. I think this would mean decriminalising it so that workers are able to go to law enforcement safely when they are sexually assaulted or raped, and prosecuting those people who do violate and do abuse sex workers, so that they aren't out there raping people, as we know that they continue to do after they do this with sex workers. And at a much larger scale, I think reducing the poverty rate so that minors don't feel the need to get into sex work to survive in the first place, would do a huge thing. I'm not a US citizen, but I'm going to plug Medicare for All here as a start to that solution. In Australia, where we have a free public Medicare system, I know that if my friend who's a personal trainer has to go to the hospital for whatever reason, she's not going to walk out with a $150K bill on her head, which would throw her instantly into poverty, and her job wouldn't be able to cover it. So while it's easy to point the finger at online platforms facilitating a lot of this stuff, taking these spaces away doesn't actually solve the root of the problem. And in many cases, it makes things increasingly more dangerous for the most vulnerable people trying to survive.
That is a story that I've heard over and over about FOSTA, yes. So just switching tack, one of the most interesting things about Assembly 4 is that it is a collective that brings together sex workers and technologists. I think, Eliza, you're a technologist by training, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I've been working in the industry for over 15 years in various roles, but I've settled in mostly information security and privacy.
So tell us a little about the networking between sex workers and technologists that you've been involved in. What are the interests that these two groups have in common?
I think there's a larger overlap with hackers and sex workers than there is technologists. We run digital privacy work groups and things like that, but I think what most people think when they think about hackers, they think about someone in a basement with a black hoodie, or on rollerblades, screaming "hack the planet." But sex workers are the ultimate hackers. They have systems working against them all the time. The structures are built around them, against them. Despite that, they're the world's oldest profession. They have found ways to survive and thrive. They're fantastic.
Yeah.
So what is one common misconception about sex work and the internet that you'd like to clear up?
One for me is, and I think I mentioned it previously, but removing sex workers or any community from the internet doesn't actually solve the root of the problem and causes more harm than it does good. So, that not being the solution would be great.
Who should our viewers or listeners be following on social media to learn more about the issues that we've been talking about today?
All right. So I have a handful, but I won't. I'll try and be quick with it because there's a few. So first one, a lot of these are on Twitter. Most of them are on Twitter, actually. So I definitely recommend jumping over there if you're not on the platform already. First one is Hacking and Hustling. You might have heard of them before if you're already familiar with the sex worker scene. They're a group of sex workers and technologists like us based in the US who have been fighting discriminatory and damaging legislation like the Earn It Bill and FOSTA SESTA. They've been doing some really, really interesting stuff, as well as providing some really interesting resources for sex workers globally, which is really cool. The next one is Maggie Mayhem, who is a sex workers' rights activist. Again, if you're in the scene, you might know of her already, but she's a speaker as well, and she's written a lot on FOSTA SESTA. One of my personal favourites at the moment, and I'm a little bit obsessed, is Chanel Gallant, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced that name. I've only ever read it and written it. But she's involved in a number of sex worker rights groups, including Butterfly and MSWP. Chanel, I believe, is an active sex worker. Could be wrong on that. But she provides a very articulate insight into what it is to be a sex worker and why we do what we do. I haven't really seen many people express themselves in a digestible way, the way that Chanel does. And I personally have found that an invaluable resource in how I communicate with people outside of the industry, as well as through my own education. They've also been in the industry or an activist in the industry for over 20 years, so they're very well versed on a lot of topics outside of sex work as well, including capitalism, patriarchy, systemic racism, and things like that. So I find that super, super interesting. The next two are Molly Smith and Juno Mack. They are the authors of Revolting Prostitutes, which is an excellent book, which I highly recommend. And it gives you a fantastic rundown on the history of sex workers' rights and sort of what we've come up against over the years. The next one is, I promise there's only four left. There's a massive list. There's only four. The next one is Lola and Eliza. She's a writer and a porn performer who does a lot of research into FOSTA, SESTA and internet legislation, so a lot of writing on it. The next two are sex workers' rights activists that I have to throw in there. Again, sorry if I mispronounced the name, but Kate Diamo and Thought Scholar. They are both involved in hacking and hustling, and they're both fantastic sex workers' rights activists. I definitely encourage people to follow them. And of course, Melissa Guerra Grant, who is the author of Playing the Whore. And she's done a lot of research into sex work and justice. So definitely recommend that. Did you have any before I take over?
The EFF, they're fantastic. Yes, everyone should follow them.
Oh, and Maggie McNeil. Oh my gosh, Maggie McNeil, of course, because she has done a lot of writing on
Maggie is
Facebook,
fantastic.
and she's a fantastic activist.
Indeed. And we did a podcast interview with her as well, which people can check out.
Oh, did you?
Yes. I'm going to link all of those resources that you just mentioned in the text part of the podcast and podcast so that people can find them. Now, so this isn't really a fully formed question, but one thing that I've come to a realization of is that the reason why we take such a different approach to child protection and specifically to child sexual abuse prevention than some other groups is a different mindset. So on the one hand, it's definitely true that child sexual abuse is gross and disgusting, but framing it as primarily a problem of it being gross and disgusting is what tends to draw in people's homophobia, transphobia, and their opposition to sex work and adult content in general. I think we have to reframe it. I mean, it is true that it's gross and disgusting, but I think we have to reframe it as instead of that being the main problem is that it's a consent violation and that it's harmful, that it causes harm. How do you think that we can, on a social level, over time, shift the narrative around sexual abuse from how gross it is to how harmful and how much of a consent violation it is? Is that something that you think we can do over time? Because it seems to me that's where the root of a lot of the problems lies.
Do you want to say this one? Yeah.
If you'd like.
You go through it.
That's a really interesting thing. I think until, as a society, we understand consent, we're not going to be able to move to that point where we say child sex victims is an act of harm. But I think it would be a better concept than what we have now, because at the moment it also shames the victims. It does nothing for them. It makes people who are involved in the industry feel better about themselves.
Excellent. Well, it's been delightful to talk to you both. I am really happy at the success that you've seen so far with both of your projects, and hoping you enjoy much continued success into the future.
Thanks so much for having us.
And thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back again next month with another episode of Sex, Human Rights and CSA Prevention. And if you want to make sure you don't miss it, please subscribe in your podcast software of choice or by clicking this button if you're watching on YouTube. Please also donate to help support our work if you can. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again next month. Bye for now.